Hi, I'm Tommy, and today we'll be talking about basslines. Now before we get started, I'm just going to be showing you the chords that we'll be developing these 5 levels of basslines under. This comes from the introduction of a reharmonization of My Boy by Billie Eilish that I did for my last EP, Reharmonizations Volume 1, that came out about 4 months ago. So the reason that I'm talking about how to write more interesting basslines today is the fact that most people write them like the first level that I'm about to show you, where all they do is just have the bass play the root note 1 or 2 octaves below. And this could be duplicated an octave above for a slightly thicker sound, but really it's all based on taste. And especially if you're tracking an actual live bass, it's not going to matter as much. The most common, and certainly one of the easiest ways to write better basslines, is to, instead of just placing the root note beneath a chord, to use thirds, fifths, sevenths, ninths, and any other intervals that seem to fit. And the point of this is to create a melody that functions kind of in counterpoint to the harmony above it. Really what you should think more about is painting the undercurrents of the story that you're attempting to express through your harmony and through your melody with the bass. For an example of that here, we start on the 3rd, go up to the 5th, and then we carry through on the chord's 5th until the 2nd note of the 3rd measure right here. And then we go, let's see, root, 3rd, root, root, root. And let's see how that sounds. So that definitely paints a much more compelling picture than it did when it was just the root notes. And there's an interesting little thing happening right over here in the final measure. The interesting thing that's happening is that it's going from a 3rd here in the 2nd half of the 3rd bar down to the root for the next 3 notes. And why that's interesting is that while it's descending from the 3rd to the root, the notes are actually going up. And so you get this feeling where it sounds as if it's moving down, but still up at the same time. It's almost as if it's moving up, but in a lower place. Another note here that I want to make is about how to choose which interval. I know that earlier I said that it's about creating a melody in counterpoint that creates the undercurrents of the story that your harmony is trying to convey. But there's a little bit more to it. The way that you pick those notes will make a very big difference. Picking a root will sound very harmonious because it will be in unison. But if you pick, say, a minor 3rd, that will give a more minor and dark and dramatic feeling. If you pick a 5th, it will give it this powerful, reinforced feeling. In fact, power chords are just a root and a 5th. They're not even a chord, which is 3 or more notes. They're just an interval because it's only 2. So if you look at the difference between level 3 here and level 2, you'll see that most of it is changed. And the reason for that is that level 3 is integrating 2 of the best tools that you can use when writing basslines. Every single diatonic note, as well as polyrhythms. And what are those? Diatonic notes are any notes that have been prescribed to you by your scale. And polyrhythms are something I'll show you in a minute. So let's dive right in and see what's happening in this specific measure. The first bar up until this G right here is nothing really special. It's going the 3rd to the 5th of the 1st chord, and then these are both the roots of the chords that they're beneath. It's in the middle of this 2nd measure here where something very interesting is going on, and this is called a polyrhythm. A polyrhythm is where you fit notes that are essentially set to a different time signature inside of the one that the song is in. So here we have these notes as if they're being played in 5/4, while the rest of the song is operating in 4/4. And I'll play that for you now. So keeping in mind that the only polyrhythmic notes are these 5, you can begin to analyze their functional usage and see how they paint an interesting picture. The first note, this B here, is the third of a G major 9, and then the next 4 notes, A, F sharp, C sharp, and then C sharp an octave above, are the third, root, and fifth of this F minor 7. And typically, if you were to line these up and keep it aligned in 4/4 and just fit it in, it would paint a similar picture, but having all 5 of these notes compressed into where typically only 4 would go gives it this kind of swirling, dancing around the harmony feeling that can be very interesting for painting a picture. It's almost as if the bassist forgot what they were doing for a second, as if they got distracted. And it paints this loose and almost drunken feeling to the rhythm that can be very useful for certain situations. When we look at the remainder of level 3, we don't see anything too outstanding until we begin to functionally analyze it. So if we start right here, there are really only 2 noteworthy things. One is jumping from a third to a 7th, right here, and this really just creates a little dramatic stab of tension. It's very attention-grabbing to go from a third to a 7th. It's a very angular jump, something that you wouldn't see much outside of genres like math rock. And then the other notable feature of this is this B right here. Let's take a look at the chord that it's beneath. Got an F sharp, an A C sharp, an E, and another A. And this chord here is an F sharp minor 7th. But where's the B at? If we were to put a B in here, it would be a 4th. And placing a 4th beneath a chord is already kind of a questionable move, but it certainly has a purpose. The purpose of it is something that Jacob Collier articulated very well when he attempted to pose a duality between 4ths and perfect 5ths as being an analog to minor thirds and major thirds. He said that 4ths carry this inherent tension to them, whereas 5ths carry this inherent resolution to them. And I really think he's onto something there. I think most people think he's onto something. But with this chord not having a 4th inside of it, the 4th still sounds kind of out of place in the bass line. However, it sounding out of place is part of its purpose. It's just like this D here, this minor 7th that we had jumped up to earlier on. The point of it is to be just out of place enough to catch the listener's ear, to get their attention back down to the bass line. One of the most important but often forgotten parts of writing good bass lines is knowing when the bass line should be noticed and when it shouldn't. Typically in traditional music, the purpose of a bass has always just been to support the guitars or the vocalist, maybe to line up with the drums, but never really anything too interesting. With electronic music especially, or with highly prepared music, or with more experimental genres though, you can definitely go about changing that. And giving the bass more attention at the right times and less at others is a fantastic way to do so. Now on to level 4. And if you compare it to level 3, which you can see right here, you can see that there aren't very many changes made. In fact, there are only 2 types. The first type we can see in this section. So if we listen through, the first odd thing is that we're not using notes in our scale, and that's exactly what level 4 is about, is chromaticism. Chromaticism is using notes that are non-diatonic, notes that aren't part of your scale, and the way that you use them has to be done very tactfully, or else it kind of just devolves into noise and chaos. So the example of chromaticism right here is used to step down. A lot of people talk about passing notes, or they talk about very subtle ways to use chromaticism, and this is a little bit more blatant than I would imagine most people would compose. But it's still a useful tool. And the point of it here is that we're going from the third down to the root, and then it's only one more step to get down to the root of the next chord. So we're taking this A minor, and we're going from C to G in the span of 6 notes. And since there are only 6 notes to go there, it works out perfectly. You can also see this type of chromaticism thrown in here in the 4th measure, where after this G and after this B, you have a G sharp and a B flat thrown in just because they sound good. If we start listening to this from halfway through, you might notice something strange. It might sound to you like a couple of notes were potentially off right here, and that's because they were. This is the second variety of chromaticism, and this is called modal interchange. If you look at these notes, they're arpeggiating a B major 7th, but they're beneath a B minor 7th, which means that your 3rd and your 7th are sharpened. Up in the chord, they're actually a D and an A instead of a D sharp and an A sharp. And what modal interchange means is that you're taking the major or minor of the same key, so in this case B, and you're typically exchanging it. So in a chord progression with B minor 7, you could switch it out for a B major 7. However, integrating this into how you write bass lines can lead to a feeling that you can't really get with many other compositional techniques. It creates this sort of tension between the harmony on top and the bass line below, almost as if the bass line is doing just what it wants to, just like with the polyrhythm earlier. It creates this separation, and it draws attention in a very strange way to the bass line, a very strange way that can be very useful. Once you've begun integrating features such as polyrhythms and chromaticism into your bass lines, there isn't much further to go. If you're using a fretless bass or perhaps a synth plugin that will allow you to slide, sliding between notes can be helpful. If you're using a real bass, things like harmonics can be interesting. But really, when it comes down to it, the only other way to add more articulation to a bass line is to add melodic elements to it. Just like composing anything else in counterpoint, adding melodies to your bass will potentially be too much. Oftentimes you can't have too much going on in a song because then nothing really stands out. If too many things are detracting from each other, nothing will be worth anything. And one of the more important things to keep in mind, like I had mentioned earlier, when writing bass lines is, when should the bass have attention and when shouldn't it? Now let's take a look at the level 5 bass line and hope that somebody like Itchy Canito or another talented bassist like Davey504 can pick it up and potentially play it. So, just like I had been saying earlier, the amount of attention that this bass line draws is, in my opinion, way too much. The first half of this part right here is just too much going on. It starts too suddenly, it's jumping around far too much. But if you're looking at some genres like R&B or soul, it's not rare to have bass solos or to have basses that are constantly jumping between lower and higher sections. And the bass certainly can be a melodic instrument just like anything else. People have proven that so many times that it's not even worth arguing. The question is do you want it to be in your song? And if so, at what parts, and to express what purpose, to show what meaning? I hope that you have found some of these techniques for writing bass lines useful, and I hope that you've also gained perspective on how bass lines can potentially fit better into your music. Thanks for watching.